The morning mist clung to the pine-covered slopes of the Bitterroot Mountains like a shroud, and Jake Morrison moved through it with the silent grace of a man who had learned to become part of the wilderness. His weathered hands gripped the familiar weight of his Winchester rifle, and his keen grey eyes scanned the forest floor for deer sign. At 42, Jake had spent the last 5 years in these mountains, and every line etched into his sun-darkened face told the story of a man who had chosen solitude over the company of his fellow human beings. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the promise of an early winter. Jake's breath formed small clouds as he crouched beside a game trail, examining the fresh tracks pressed into the damp earth. A good-sized buck had passed this way not more than an hour ago, heading toward the creek that wound its way down from the high country. Jake rose slowly, his buckskin jacket creaking softly. He'd been tracking this particular deer for 3 days now, and his larder was running low. Winter in the Montana Territory was unforgiving, and a man needed meat to survive the long months ahead. He adjusted the worn leather strap of his rifle and began following the trail with practiced patience. The forest was alive with the sounds of autumn, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a hawk, the scurrying of small creatures preparing for winter's grip. These were the sounds that had become Jake's companions, replacing the laughter of children and the gentle voice of a woman he had once loved. He pushed those thoughts aside as he had countless times before. The past was buried with Mary and little Thomas back in Kansas, claimed by the fever that had taken so many that terrible summer of 1877. As he moved deeper into the valley, Jake noticed something that made him pause. Mixed with the deer tracks were the prints of shod horses, at least 3 of them moving fast. His weathered brow furrowed. Few people ventured this far into the mountains, especially not riding hard like these tracks suggested. Uneasiness settled in his stomach like a cold stone. The deer trail led toward Willow Creek, where Jake had built a small hunting blind years ago. But as he approached the familiar clearing, the sound of voices carried on the wind made him freeze. Jake crept forward, using the thick underbrush as cover, until he could see into the clearing beside the creek. 3 men on horseback were there, and what Jake saw made his blood run cold. A woman lay motionless on the ground, her dress torn and dirty, her face a mess of bruises and dried blood. The men were arguing in low, urgent tones. "You sure she's dead, boss?" asked a thin man with a scraggly beard, nervously adjusting his hat. The man he'd addressed was clearly the leader, well-dressed despite the wilderness setting, with a thick mustache and cold, calculating eyes. "She better be, Hendricks. After what she put me through, she deserves worse than this." The third man, younger than the others, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Maybe we should check, Mr. Mitchell. What if someone finds her and she's still—" "She won't be talking to anyone," Mitchell cut him off sharply. "The beating I gave her would have killed a horse. Now let's get back to town before someone notices we're gone." Jake's hands tightened on his rifle as the 3 men wheeled their horses around and rode out of the clearing at a gallop. He waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely before emerging from his hiding place. His heart was pounding, not from fear, but from a rage he hadn't felt in years. He approached the woman cautiously. She was young, maybe 25, with auburn hair matted with blood and dirt. Her breathing was shallow but steady. She was alive, barely. Jake knelt beside her, his experienced hands checking for broken bones. Her left arm was definitely broken, and her face was so swollen he could barely make out her features. But she was breathing, and that meant there was hope. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice rusty from disuse. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, and she made a small, pained sound. Jake looked around the clearing, his mind racing. He was at least 8 miles from his cabin, and she was in no condition to ride. But leaving her here meant certain death. If the cold didn't take her, the wolves or bears would. Jake Morrison had spent 5 years avoiding human contact, content in his solitude. But as he looked down at this broken woman, something stirred in his chest that he thought had died with his family. He couldn't walk away, he wouldn't. "It's going to be all right," he whispered, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I'm going to get you somewhere safe." Underscore 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 underscore. Chapter 2. The Rescue. Jake worked quickly, knowing that every minute counted. He removed his heavy coat and wrapped it around the unconscious woman, then fashioned a makeshift stretcher using fallen branches and leather strips. The journey back to his cabin was the longest 8 miles of Jake's life. Sarah had to stop frequently to rest, not from his own exhaustion, but never fully to check on Sarah's condition as he carefully moved her. Her breathing remained shallow but steady, and her pulse, while weak, never faltered. Jake found himself talking to her as they traveled, his voice a low, comforting rumble in the quiet forest. "Just hold on there, miss. We're almost home," he said, though they still had miles to go. "Got a warm cabin and a good fire waiting. You just keep fighting." The sun was setting by the time Jake's cabin came into view, its log walls and stone chimney a welcome sight after the harrowing day. He'd built the structure himself, choosing a spot sheltered by tall pines with a clear view of the valley below. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms with a small porch, but it had been home for 5 years. Jake carefully carried Sarah inside and laid her on his own bed, the only real bed in the cabin. He quickly built up the fire in the stone hearth, filling the room with warmth and flickering light. Then he lit the oil lamp and got his first good look at the extent of her injuries. It was worse than he'd thought. Besides the broken arm, she had several cracked ribs, a deep gash across her forehead, and bruises covering most of her body. Jake had some experience with battlefield medicine from his time as a cavalry scout, but this level of brutality made his stomach turn. No man should ever raise his hand to a woman, no matter what the provocation. He heated water over the fire and began the delicate process of cleaning her wounds. Sarah stirred several times during his ministrations, once even opening her eyes briefly. They were a startling blue, like mountain lakes, but clouded with pain and confusion. "Easy now," Jake murmured, dampening a cloth with warm water. "You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." He fashioned a splint for her arm, using wooden slats and strips torn from his own shirt. The work was slow and careful, and Jake found himself surprised by how gentle his hands could still be. For 5 years they had known only the roughness of survival, cutting wood, skinning game, working leather. But touching this broken woman, he remembered a different time when those same hands had braided his daughter's hair and soothed her fears during thunderstorms. As he worked, Jake's mind kept returning to the 3 men he'd seen in the clearing. The leader, Mitchell, had spoken like a man used to getting his way, used to having his orders followed without question. The expensive cut of his clothes suggested wealth, and wealthy men in frontier towns usually meant one thing: power. The kind of power that could make problems disappear and questions go unasked. Jake had avoided Copper Creek and its politics for years, content to trade his furs once a season and retreat back to his mountain sanctuary. But if he was right about Mitchell, then helping this woman might bring more trouble than he'd bargained for. He looked down at Sarah's battered face and felt his resolve harden. Let them come. He'd faced worse odds during the Indian campaigns, and he'd learned long ago that some things were worth fighting for. By midnight, Jake had done all he could. Sarah's wounds were clean and bandaged, her arm properly splinted, and she was resting under warm blankets near the fire. Her color was better, and her breathing had deepened into something approaching natural sleep. Jake settled into his wooden chair beside the bed, his rifle across his knees. He wouldn't sleep tonight, couldn't risk it with Sarah so badly hurt. Instead, he watched the steady rise and fall of her chest and listened to the familiar sounds of the mountain night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Sarah would need food and continued care, and eventually she would be strong enough to tell him her story. Jake suspected it would be a tale of cruelty and desperation, the kind that was all too common on the frontier, where the law was often whatever a powerful man said it was. But tonight, she was safe. Tonight, she was healing. And for the first time in 5 years, Jake Morrison felt like he had a purpose beyond mere survival. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, and Jake kept his vigil. Outside, the wind sighed through the pine trees, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the star-filled sky. But inside the cabin there was only warmth, safety, and the quiet breathing of a woman who had found sanctuary in the most unlikely of places. Chapter 3. Awakening. Sarah's eyes opened to unfamiliar surroundings. Rough-hewn log walls, a stone fireplace crackling with warmth, and the scent of coffee brewing somewhere nearby. For a moment, panic seized her as memory flooded back. Thomas's rage, his fists, the searing pain, and then darkness. She tried to sit up, but her body screamed in protest, and a gentle hand pressed her back down. "Easy there, miss. You've been hurt pretty bad." The voice was deep, weathered like old leather, but surprisingly gentle. Sarah turned her head carefully and found herself looking into kind grey eyes set in a face that spoke of years spent under the open sky. The man was perhaps 40, with dark hair streaked with silver and a beard that had been recently trimmed. "Where?" she began, her voice little more than a whisper. "My cabin. Found you yesterday morning by Willow Creek." Jake pulled his chair closer to the bed. "Name's Jake Morrison. You've been sleeping near on 18 hours. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her face, feeling the bandages and the tender swelling beneath. The memories were fragmented, but clear enough. Thomas discovering her hidden stash of money, the money she'd been saving to escape, his explosion of fury that had been worse than any before. "They left me for dead," she said quietly, more to herself than to Jake. "Near enough," Jake replied, offering her a tin cup filled with warm broth. "Can you tell me your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell." The name felt like poison on her tongue now. Jake's expression darkened at the surname, confirming what she already knew. He had seen them, had heard Thomas talking. "Mitchell, that would make the well-dressed fellow your husband." Sarah nodded, accepting the cup with trembling hands. The broth was simple but warming, and she realized she hadn't eaten in over a day. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving me. For everything." Any decent man would have done the same. Jake stood and moved to the small kitchen area, ladling more broth from a pot hanging over the fire. "Though I reckon not many men around these parts would stand up to Thomas Mitchell." The bitterness in his voice wasn't lost on Sarah. "You know him?" "Know of him. Owns the biggest ranch in 3 counties, has the sheriff and half the town council in his pocket." Jake returned with more broth and a piece of cornbread. "From what I saw yesterday, seems like he's got a mean streak wide as the Missouri." Sarah's eyes filled with tears she'd held back for too long. "It wasn't always like this. When we married 2 years ago, he was different, charming, even gentle sometimes. But the drinking got worse, and when things didn't go his way..." She touched her bandaged face again. "A man who beats his wife ain't much of a man at all," Jake said quietly. "You planning on going back to him?" "Never." The word came out with a force that surprised both of them. "I'd rather die first. I was saving money to leave, to go back east where I have family. That's what set him off this time. He found my hiding place." Jake nodded, understanding more than she knew. He'd seen too many broken people in his time, both during the war and after. Some could be mended, others were too far gone. But looking at Sarah, despite her injuries, he saw something unbroken in her spirit, a core of steel that Thomas Mitchell hadn't been able to touch. "You're welcome to stay here while you heal up," he offered. "It ain't much, but it's safe, and it's far enough from town that Mitchell won't think to look here." "I can't ask you to..." "You ain't asking. I'm offering." Jake's tone brooked no argument. "You're hurt, and winter's coming on. Besides," he added with the ghost of a smile, "it's been a while since I had someone to cook for besides myself." Over the next few days, Sarah slowly regained her strength. Jake proved to be a surprisingly attentive caregiver, checking her injuries regularly and ensuring she ate well. He'd learned field medicine during his cavalry days, he explained, and had patched up more than his share of wounded men. Sarah began to learn about her rescuer as well. He'd been living alone in the mountains for 5 years, she discovered, ever since losing his wife and young son to fever. The pain of that loss was still etched in the lines around his eyes, though he spoke of it matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "What made you come out here?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire, Sarah wrapped in quilts in the wooden chair, while Jake tended to his weapons. "Couldn't stay in Kansas after Mary and Tommy died," he said, running an oiled cloth along his rifle barrel. "Too many memories. Figured the mountains might be far enough away to outrun the ghosts." "Did it work?" Jake looked up from his rifle, meeting her eyes across the firelight. "Some days, others not so much, but it's been bearable." He paused, then added quietly, "More bearable these past few days, truth be told." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time in 2 years, she felt safe, protected by someone who asked for nothing in return except the simple pleasure of her company. But their peaceful interlude was about to be shattered. underscore 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 underscore. He'd spotted riders in the valley below. Underscore underscore. 3 men moving systematically. Chapter 4. Checking every cabin and settlement within 20 miles of Copper Creek. On Sarah's 5th day, they're looking for you. Jake returned from checking his trap his rifle with methodical precision. Mitchell's not content to leave well enough alone. Sarah's face went pale. Maybe I should leave. I don't want to bring trouble to your door. Where would you go? Jake asked practically. You're still healing, winter's coming, and you don't know this country. Besides, his jaw tightened, I don't much like the idea of men threatening folks on my mountain. From her chair by the fire, Sarah watched Jake prepare for what seemed inevitable. He cleaned and loaded not just his rifle, but a shotgun and 2 pistols as well. He checked his ammunition supply and made sure his knives were sharp. There was no bravado in his preparations, just the careful attention of a man who understood that violence might be the only language his enemies would understand. You were a soldier, Sarah observed, noting the methodical way he went about his tasks. Cavalry scout for 10 years before I married Mary, fought in the Indian campaigns, rode with some hard men. Jake paused in his work, meeting her eyes. I'm not proud of everything I did in those days, but I learned how to survive when the odds were stacked against me. 3 against 1 aren't good odds. Depends on the 3 and the 1. Jake's smile was grim but confident. Besides, I know every trail, every hiding place, every rock and tree for miles around. They'll be fighting on my ground by my rules. That afternoon, Jake's prediction proved accurate. Sarah was resting when Jake suddenly appeared at her side. His finger pressed to his lips for silence. Through the cabin's single window, she could see 3 riders approaching through the trees. Thomas and his 2 hired men. Jake handed Sarah one of his pistols. You know how to use this? She nodded, her hands surprisingly steady as she checked the weapon. My father taught me before he died. Good. Stay quiet and keep that handy. If things go bad, there's a root cellar behind the cabin. Hide there and don't come out for anyone but me. Jake stepped onto his porch as the riders entered the small clearing around his cabin. Thomas Mitchell looked even more imposing up close, a big man with cold eyes and an air of absolute authority. His companions flanked him, hands resting casually on their gun belts. Afternoon, Jake called out, his own hands empty but ready. You gentlemen lost. Looking for someone, Mitchell replied, his voice carrying the tone of a man used to being obeyed. My wife ran off a few days back. Thought maybe a good Samaritan might have taken her in. Haven't seen hide nor hair of any woman, Jake lied smoothly. Don't get many visitors up here. Mitchell's eyes narrowed as he studied Jake's face. That's so, because I heard tell there was some mountain man who might be harboring stolen property. Stolen property? Jake's voice hardened. That's an interesting way to talk about your wife. A woman belongs to her husband, same as a horse or a cow, Mitchell said, his hand moving closer to his pistol. And when property goes missing, a man has the right to get it back. Well, like I said, haven't seen any women up here. Jake's stance shifted almost imperceptibly, weight balanced, ready for action. Might be you should check with the sheriff if you're missing something valuable. Mitchell's laugh was harsh. The sheriff works for me, mountain man, just like most everyone else in this territory. He leaned forward in his saddle. So I'll ask you one more time. Where is my wife? Inside the cabin, Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside the window, the pistol heavy in her hands. She could hear the menace in Thomas's voice, see the way his men were positioning themselves. This was exactly what she'd feared, her presence putting Jake in mortal danger. And I'll tell you one more time, Jake replied calmly. I haven't seen any woman. Now, if you're done socializing, you're welcome to move along. This is private property. Mitchell's face flushed with anger. You know what I think? I think you're lying. I think my property is in that cabin right now, and I think you're going to hand her over, or things are going to get unpleasant. Jake's smile was cold as winter steel. Mister, I've had unpleasant days before. Question is, are you sure you want to start something you might not be able to finish? The tension in the clearing was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah could see Thomas's hand hovering over his gun, could see the way his men were spreading out to get better angles. In a few seconds, this confrontation would turn deadly, and it would be her fault. She made her decision. Thomas. Sarah's voice cut through the tension as she stepped onto the porch, the pistol held steady in her hands. "You found me." Mitchell's eyes lit up with triumph and rage. "Sarah, darling, there you are. We've been so worried about you." "I'll just bet you have," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Worried you might have to explain to folks how your wife ended up beaten half to death and left for the wolves." Jake tensed, ready to move, but Sarah caught his eye and shook her head slightly. She had a plan, dangerous as it was. "Now, Sarah," Mitchell said, his voice taking on the full sweetness she remembered so well, "you know you had an accident. Hit your head when you fell down those stairs, made you confused, made you wander off, but you're better now, and it's time to come home." "The only accident," Sarah said, raising the pistol to point directly at her husband's chest, "was me marrying you in the first place." Chapter 5. Freedom's Price. The silence stretched like a taut wire across the clearing. Thomas Mitchell's face had gone from flushed anger to pale shock as he stared down the barrel of his wife's pistol. His hired men shifted nervously in their saddles, uncertain how to handle a situation where their boss's wife had become the threat. "Sarah, put that gun down," Thomas said, his voice losing its false sweetness. "You're making a mistake. You're my wife, and you're coming home with me." "I stopped being your wife the moment you decided I was property instead of a person," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And this isn't my home anymore." She glanced briefly at Jake, who stood coiled and ready beside her. "I've found something better." Jake stepped forward slightly, his own hand now resting on his pistol grip. "The lady's made her choice, Mitchell. Seems like you should respect that." "The lady," Mitchell spat, his mask finally dropping completely, "is a hysterical woman who doesn't know what's good for her. And you, Mountain Man, are interfering with a husband's rights. That's a hanging offense in some parts." "Good thing we're not in those parts," Jake replied calmly. "This is my land, and on my land a woman's word means something." Hendricks, the thin man with the scraggly beard, was growing visibly nervous. "Boss, maybe we should just—" "Shut up," Mitchell snapped, his eyes never leaving Sarah. "Sarah, I'm going to count to 3. Then you're going to put that gun down and get on my horse, or things are going to get very bad for your friend here." Sarah felt her resolve waver for just a moment. She'd seen Thomas's capacity for violence firsthand, and she couldn't bear the thought of Jake being hurt because of her. But then she remembered the past 5 days, the gentleness in Jake's hands as he tended her wounds, the way he'd listened to her fears without judgment, the quiet strength that made her feel safe for the first time in years. "No," she said simply. Thomas's hand moved toward his gun. 1. Jake's body tensed, ready to draw. The 2 hired men began reaching for their weapons, but their movements were hesitant, uncertain. 2. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. She'd never shot a man before, but she'd grown up on a farm, knew her way around firearms. At this distance, she couldn't miss. "Boss," the younger hired man said suddenly, his voice cracking with fear, "I didn't sign up to get shot by some woman. This ain't worth $20. "Stay where you are, Collins," Mitchell commanded, but his voice carried less authority now. The word was cut off by the sharp crack of Sarah's pistol. The bullet struck the ground directly in front of Mitchell's horse, sending the animal rearing and nearly unseating its rider. In the same instant, Jake drew his own weapon with the fluid motion of a man who'd done it 1,000 times before. "Next one goes through your chest, Thomas," Sarah called out, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I suggest you think real carefully about your next move." Mitchell fought to control his spooked horse, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "You'll regret this, Sarah. Both of you will regret this." "Maybe," Jake said, his pistol now trained on Hendricks, "but you won't be around to see it. You've got about 10 seconds to get off my land before I decide you're trespassing with ill intent." Collins, the younger hired man, was already backing his horse away from the confrontation. "I'm done, Mr. Mitchell. Find yourself another boy to do your dirty work." He wheeled his mount around and rode hard toward the valley, leaving dust and the sound of hoofbeats in his wake. Hendricks looked between his boss and Jake's steady gun barrel, clearly calculating his odds. "Hendricks," Mitchell said through gritted teeth, "we're not leaving without her." "Sorry, boss," Hendricks replied, his hands raised slightly. "But like Collins said, this ain't what we signed up for. Mountain Man's got the drop on us and the woman's armed too. Sometimes you got to know when to fold." He too began backing his horse away from the clearing, though more slowly than Collins had. Mitchell found himself alone, facing two armed opponents on unfamiliar ground. The rage in his eyes was murderous, but he wasn't a stupid man. He'd built his wealth and power through calculation and intimidation, not through reckless bravery. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice low and deadly. "Sarah, you're still my wife in the eyes of God and the law, and you," he pointed at Jake, "you're harboring another man's property. I'll have the territorial marshal up here, and then we'll see how tough you are." "You do that," Jake replied. "But until then, you're trespassing. And in these mountains, that can be hazardous to a man's health." Mitchell jerked his reins hard, wheeling his horse around. "You'll both pay for this. Mark my words, you'll both pay." He spurred his mount and rode out of the clearing at a gallop, his horse's hooves throwing up clods of earth and fallen leaves. Jake kept his pistol drawn until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely into the distance. Only then did he holster the weapon and turn to Sarah, who was standing with her arms wrapped around herself, trembling from the aftermath of adrenaline. "You all right?" he asked gently. Sarah nodded, then shook her head, then laughed, a sound that was part relief and part hysteria. "I can't believe I shot at him. I actually shot at my own husband." "You did what you had to do," Jake said, moving closer. "And you did it well. Kept your head. Made your point without killing anyone. That takes courage." "He'll be back," Sarah said, the reality of their situation settling over her. "With more men, maybe with the law. Thomas doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget." Jake nodded grimly. "I know, we've got some thinking to do, some planning. Winter's coming on hard, which works in our favor. Won't be easy for a large group to get up here once the snow starts flying. But come spring, I'll be gone," Sarah said quietly. "I won't let you face that because of me." Jake turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious. "Where would you go?" "East. I have an aunt in Philadelphia, if she's still alive. I could start over there, find work, make a new life." "That's one option," Jake agreed. "But there's another one." Sarah looked at him questioningly. "You could stay," he said simply. "Not as a guest, not as someone hiding from her past, but as my partner, my equal. Help me work this land, build something together." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and hope. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat at the thought, not just of safety, but of belonging somewhere again, of being valued for who she was rather than owned like property. "Jake," she said softly, "we've known each other less than a week." "I've known you long enough to see who you are," he replied. "Strong enough to survive what that bastard put you through, brave enough to stand up to him with a gun in your hand, gentle enough to trust a stranger with your pain. That's more than I knew about Mary when I asked her to marry me, and we had 20 good years together." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, not tears of pain this time, but of something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. "What about Thomas? What about the law?" "We'll face whatever comes," Jake said, stepping closer. "Together, if you're willing. I spent 5 years trying to outrun my ghosts, and all I managed to do was exist. These past few days, helping you heal, talking with you by the fire, for the first time since Mary and Tommy died, I've felt alive again." Sarah looked into his weathered face, saw the sincerity there, the quiet strength that had already protected her once. She thought of the alternative, running east to an uncertain future, always looking over her shoulder, always afraid that Thomas might find her. "It won't be easy," she warned. "Nothing worthwhile ever is." Sarah made her decision. She reached out and took Jake's calloused hand in both of hers, feeling the strength and gentleness there that had become her anchor in the storm. "Then I guess we'd better start preparing for spring," she said. Jake's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Yes, Ma'am, I guess we had better." As they stood together in the clearing where she'd faced down her demons, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The mountains stretched around them, vast and wild and free, offering the promise of a future built not on fear and submission, but on mutual respect and shared strength. Winter was coming, and with it would come new challenges. Thomas Mitchell would undoubtedly return, perhaps with the law behind him, perhaps with hired guns. But Sarah was no longer the broken woman who'd been left for dead beside Willow Creek. She was stronger now, tested by fire, and proven in the crucible of confrontation. She was no longer alone. Hand in hand, they walked back to the cabin that had become home, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Above them, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering their tracks and blanketing the mountains in pristine white, a clean slate upon which to write their new beginning. The mountain had given Jake Morrison purpose again, and it had given Sarah Mitchell, soon to be Sarah Morrison, her freedom. In return, they would give it their loyalty, their sweat, and their determination to build something lasting in this harsh but beautiful wilderness. Behind them, the clearing stood empty, except for the marks of their stand against tyranny. But those marks, like the couple walking away from them, spoke of courage, resilience, and the unshakable truth that some things are worth fighting for. Their story was just beginning.